Greetings, fellow thinkers and drinkers. Now, when it comes to Deep Purple, fans can divide themselves along lines of different eras, different lineups or marks, as we in the know refer to them. There are, for example, the Ritchie Blackmore purists out there. There are even those who would champion the album recorded with Tommy Bolin. There are those of us who embrace the Steve Morse era, and I have no doubt that Simon McBride is already, and quite rightly, developing a following of his own. There are also those who favor the period featuring David Coverdale and Glenn Hughes. And no doubt, even the earliest days of Mark I has its advocates. And for those, perhaps of a more ecumenical disposition, I'm certain that the Ian Pace era also has its devotees. My own views, for what it's worth, sits at something of a tangent to this. I maintain that the music the band created with Ian Gillan and Roger Glover is vastly superior to the music they created without Ian Gillan and Roger Glover. But that is by the by. What is rarely discussed, or certainly much less discussed, is the dichotomy between created also by between the Jon Lord and Don Airey eras, which coincidentally enough is the subject of this video. Of course, one must be cautious when making such comparisons. Jon Lord founded Deep Purple in the late 60s, at a time where the musical landscape was very, very different. Airey, by contrast, joined the band well into the latter half of their career, in an era where, particularly in a live context, the boundaries of what groups could indulge in had considerably shifted. I mean, there was, even at the time of the reunion, a decided move to a more structured, even conservative approach, with less emphasis on, I'm talking about in a live setting here, with less emphasis on extended improvisation and free-form jamming. And yet still, I think in terms of contribution, in terms of compositions, their relative stage presence, their live performances, I think it's still entirely possible to draw meaningful comparisons and make, hopefully, interesting observations. Well, we shall see, shall we? Okay, John obviously formed the band when it was still under the concept of Roundabout, even before it became Deep Purple. But even back in those days, with, a strong theoretical grounding in music, coupled with several years of honing his craft in various bands, Lord stood apart in experience, from his co-founders of Deep Purple. Being a few years their senior undoubtedly helped, but Lord was, quite clearly the most credible and dominant musical figure in the band's formative years. And I think this is evident in his classically influenced dominance of the Mark I era. And noticeable here that within Deep Purple, the keyboards did not augment. They led and they defined. However, following the concerto, Ritchie Blackmore and his guitar would begin to fight or contest that dominance, eventually achieving parity before going on to ultimately gain supremacy. But for a time, however, this creative tension proved immensely productive, helping to forge some of the band's finest work. If we just think, from In Rock through to Who Do We Think We Are, I think Lord is compositionally his most assertive, especially towards the very beginning of that run. And things of tracks such as, In Rock's at Speed King, particularly something like Hard Loving Man, they very much bear his structural imprint. The organ is not an addition, but it's very much part of the architecture, locking in with the guitar to create that intense, that driving sound, dense driving sound, even. And Child in Time takes this a little further, does it not? His sustained organ work forms the entire foundation of the piece. And I think both, one can say both harmonically even, as well as dynamically. Around the time of Machine Head, but I think most notably post Mark II, his compositional dominance began to recede, and I think quite dramatically. But his impact as a performer remained formidable. I mean, for example, Highway's Star features, a solo of almost classical precision. Yeah, it's tightly constructed, all right, not freely improvised, but while his, live performances on something like Space Trucking clearly demonstrated his ability to push the band, into more exploratory territory. I mean, not to mention, his many other iconic solos, but we don't want to be here all day. But I think even as late as Rat Bat Blue, fusion of the classical discipline and hard rock aggression remains very much intact, and his solo standing, as a final for Mark II, emphatic statement of intent. And I think as much as his, on Machine Head, perhaps his composing contributions were beginning to recede, he certainly had to step up to the plate on Who Do We Think We Are, largely due to the absence of Blackmore and his ideas. But I can't help but think of, for example, Our Lady would probably never have made it to the album had Blackmore been committed to the writing process. That may be, and especially I think once Mark III and especially even more so perhaps from Mark IV, the writing process became increasingly guitar-led. But his Lord's presence is still very much there to shape the music in its execution, if not perhaps as much in its composition and construction. The balance may shift, but the authority of his playing never did. As I said, throughout, I think this trajectory continues and increases throughout, the Mark III and IV as lineups, as, new blood and new influences begin to assert themselves. Especially by the band's final tour of that era. Lord is often on stage working overtime, is he not? Largely compensating for Tommy Bolin's inconsistent performances and at times, the complete absence of the guitar. Do I need to say this? But in terms of live performance, his contribution to the band was equally, if not more, crucial. Now, the presence of these two lead instrumentalists could, and often did, create competition for prominence. Yet for a considerable period, Blackmore and Lord proved not merely compatible, but, remarkably complementary. They developed an almost telepathic understanding of one another's playing, resulting in performances of exceptional cohesion and intensity. Pushing or fusing classical influences with rock and jazz, Lord rapidly established himself as one of the genre's most formidable live performers. And in particular as an improviser, where he was very daring, very unpredictable and expansive, willing to take risks, yet he almost never, and in fact I've never heard him, lose control. This was not playing with reckless abandon, but this was a calculated boldness underpinned by an amazing technique and a great musical intelligence. It was also enabled by the extraordinary level of understanding with the band, particularly during the Mark II era, where interplay and responsiveness elevated the performances beyond mere execution, into something far more dynamic and compelling. And he had it when it came to stage presence, did he not? He was tall with that, unmistakable statesman-like air that he possessed. And, he just had stage presence let's call it charisma, in abundance. And it is no easy task to remain a focal point while positioned behind a vast array of keyboards, but he had the natural charisma to command attention regardless. And such presence cannot be taught, nor can it be manufactured. You either possess it or you do not, and he possessed it in full. Commanded the stage without any real recourse to theatrics or cheap tricks. His authority derived from his ability, from the sheer weight of musical substance he brought, and supported, I think, by that innate and effortless charisma he had. I think also, with his refined voice, his educated voice, shall we say, his natural eloquence and easy, good-natured manner. It was quite obvious why in the early days, he emerged as the band's natural spokesman, and by all accounts, one of its most, rewarding interviewees, which probably remained the case until Blackmore's influence grew, or perhaps when a more provocative or salacious headline-grabbing quote was required. We'll just leave that one there, shall we? However, come the reunion, things had changed. The musical world had just changed generally, and the bands were no longer, I don't care who we're talking about, were able to, go off on their 20-minute improvised jams on stage as they had in the 70s, Now, by the time of the reunion and going forward, that latitude had largely disappeared. Performances, therefore, became tighter, more disciplined, and, the renditions were more faithful to the recorded versions. The emphasis had shifted from exploration to execution. What was lost in unpredictability, I suppose one would say, was gained in consistency, but, the sense of danger, or something genuinely new or spontaneous unfolding at the moment was inevitably diminished. Like I said, that was true of just about everybody out there. Not purely Deep Purple. But that was not the only change, however. The reunited Deep Purple was, to a very large extent, the Ritchie Blackmore project. There's no question that the band could not have reunited without Lord and still called itself Deep Purple. That was never going to fly. They would have, instantly lost a lot of credibility. However, whatever sense of democracy that had informed the writing process in the 1970s had largely disappeared. The dynamic had shifted considerably. And in essence, the rest of the band were there, more often than not, to shape Blackmore's ideas into, the best songs they could be, rather than contributing to the writing process on an equal footing. I'm not suggesting here that Lord had been was further reduced to the almost sideman role he occupied in Whitesnake. Nevertheless, I think it would be difficult to argue he had the same creative input he once enjoyed in the 70s. And this would be a role he seemed to have accepted. When the band went on tour, his, especially, we're talking about Lord here, his live performances remained powerful throughout the reunion period. Albeit within the more, constrained framework I have just described. But he increasingly found himself not only performing his own parts, but also compensating for Blackmore, particularly, when the latter's rhythm duties were being neglected. And in some ways this was a subtle but very telling shift in responsibility for him. As was typical of bands of the era, Lord retained his nightly solo spot, though it was noticeably more structured and predetermined than it had been in the 70s. I mean, you listen to shows from, The Perfect Strangers or the House of Blue Light tour when he does his solo spot. It's good. And yes, there are bits that'll be different every night. But, is this 1969? No. I don't say it's better or worse. It's just different. But, okay, he did retain and exercise a degree of freedom, let's say, from night to night. Allowing, for those moments of spontaneous personal expression. And the band did largely retain Speed King, I think. Yes, it was Speed King, as the primary outlet, for the band's more open-ended playing and jamming. Yet even here, that sense of improvisational freedom was diminished. Again, you listen to, sequential dates on the tour, or even recording from the beginning, middle, and the end of the tour. It is what it is. The performances generally were tighter, more controlled, certainly competent, but they're simply less exploratory than they had been at their 70s peak. That said, both Lord and the band continued to deliver, impressive, great, and inspirational on occasion live performance, and Lord certainly retained his commanding stage presence. But you cannot ignore the broader shift. His role within the band had clearly changed, even if it began in the 1970s. By this point, he had moved from leader to participant. Now, come the Steve Morse era, Lord's contributions, I think, can best be described as a game of two halves. On perpendicular, and I think from the very first time since the late 60s, very early 70s, one feels his role in the writing process as most prominent and committed. Again, as I said, you would probably have to go back to the Mark I or perhaps the In Rock or Fireball period. At least that's the feeling one gets. And I have discussed this in detail in a previous video, as I have his much reduced contribution to the follow-up album, Abandon, so I'm not going to repeat myself here. But from Abandon onwards, one gets the sense that his heart was no longer fully in the Deep Purple project. And not only because of the relentless touring, but I think because his musical interests were increasingly turning back towards his classical roots, which was the area which he would devote the remainder of his career to after he eventually left the band in 2002. Now, on a live front, again, like the rest of the band, he was initially reinvigorated by the arrival of Steve Morse, with whom he also very quickly developed an extraordinary live chemistry. And the result was, I think, at least initially, a series of utterly compelling live performances. This period, at least at first, marked something a return of the spirit of live improvisation, I think, from the past. Not to the extent it was. There's no 20-minute instrumental passages going on here. But I think this renewed sense of improvisation was present and very vital. Certainly the spirit of it was there. But again, I think by the time, by the end of his time with the band, I think this again had been somewhat curtailed. He still contributed inspired soloing, but the group itself was becoming increasingly guitar-centric once more, though, and I have to emphasize this, on this occasion, not at the insistence of the guitar player. And again, throughout this period, he retained his fine commanding stage presence. I think as he aged gracefully, he did develop an additional, very almost avuncular charm to him, did he not? Even Blackmore admitted that if he could choose one person on earth with whom to share a bottle of wine in a conversation, it would be Lord. And I think that point scarcely needs labouring. And I think until the end of his time with the band, he remained essential, inspirational on occasions, but I think in the latter years, in hindsight, with one foot clearly out of the door. Now, Don Airey was asked to replace him, and according to the band, no one else was seriously considered, which says much in itself. Airey already had a considerable CV by this point, Gary Moore, Rainbow, Black Sabbath, Ozzy Osbourne, and, more. The list of his contributions is immense. And I do remember at the time, this gave me pause for thought at least. Airey was a prolific contributor even, a session musician, if you like. But his reputation as a full-time band member was, shall we say, less established. None of which is to question his musical ability. Now, rather, there was, at least for me, a sense that his arrival might signal a shift towards more guitar-focused direction with keyboards, relegated to their equal prominence on stage, as it were. But in terms of the new material, perhaps more for embellishment or background textures, which would have been consistent, or this approach would have been consistent with his role in Rainbow, for example. Or perhaps one could even argue it would have just been an extension of the trajectory of Lord's own role that had began with the reunion. Well, those were my thoughts at the time. What exactly did we get? Well, frankly, my fears, if you want to put it like that, proved to be completely unfounded. Now, I've said before, I am not a fan of Bananas, Airey's first album with the band, which I've discussed in detail in a separate video, but that's purely a matter of taste. However, I am a huge admirer of their subsequent albums together, and since then he has contributed to, Rapture of the Deep, Now What, Infinite Whoosh, and Equals One. And I do not think it is in any way controversial to say that its songwriting contribution has been significant, if not indeed substantial. And this is not merely a matter of assisting with arrangements or adding sonic layers to material that has already been developed. No, he's actually actively bringing ideas to the table that is actively shaping the nature of the songs themselves. He has become a genuine contributor to the writing process, alongside Morse and now McBride and Glover. And I have to say, this stands in clear contrast to Lord's own post-reunion role, in which he largely coloured the music rather than constructed it, whereas Airey, I maintain, has been more directly involved in its creation. Admittedly, Airey never had to contend with Blackmore in Deep Purple. Just throw that out there. But what do I mean? Look, there's two songs, Rapture of the Deep and All I Got Is You, are by common consent tracks which Airey brought the core musical ideas. Okay? Yet, there are more, but we can't be here all night. But I maintain his influence can be heard consistently throughout the band's modern output. For example, since his arrival, I think the music has taken on a decidedly more progressive, proggy flavour. But however, to their credit, they have never descended into excess with this, nor has it ever lost its, sense of proportion. But you can hear it. I think vis-a-vis anything from the reunion onwards, and even including the first two Morse-era albums, I think there's a very different sense of movement towards the more progressive, shall we say, since Airey has joined the band. Not that it's dominating particularly, but it does allow the songs to breathe in a different way, to flow in a different way, and perhaps to develop in a different way, rather than simply being relentlessly driven forward. There's greater emphasis on atmosphere, and texture and a wider use of harmonic color and increased dynamic content within individual songs. All right, think of The Surprising or Bird of Prey, or think of Vincent Price or Man Alive. Again, I'm not going to go through the entire catalogue, but if you don't get the point now, probably you never will. But I think there should be, a pattern should be clear at this point, which I think goes on to prove that Airey had formed a highly productive and empathetic and sympathetic writing partnership with Morse and Glover, one which I would argue has produced some of the strongest music the band has recorded in its later period, or perhaps ever. As for the current direction, it remains to be seen. How his partnership or his interactions with Simon McBride develop. One thing I will say about =1 is that it didn't. It was surprisingly. I expected it to be much more markedly different from the Morse era than it was. But again, I have another video on that if you want my opinion on =1. Now, Deep Purple are first and foremost a live band. So how does Airey fare vis-a-vis Jon Lord? Well, for reasons already discussed. The kind of extended improvisation and free-flowing jam of the 70s is unlikely to resonate with a modern audience. Or is it? Can I be the only one who sometimes wish they'd just give it a go? 2-hour show, 8 songs, couple of encores. I mean, I'd like to be there if they tried it. I really would. Got no idea how it would go over. Absolutely none, but be nice if they would give it a go. Just for the hell of it. Who knows? Well, okay. But as things currently stand, shows are perhaps more structured than ever before. Now, while this has been true since the reunion, I do, and again, this could be me, I do get a feeling that, especially since Morse has left, the shows are more structured than they ever have been. Not a criticism, an observation. Again, it may just be me. Do the band still improvise with Don Airey? Well, yes, they say they do, and who am I to question them? However, I do think that the nature of these things has changed. And it's possible to me, at least, that even if you're attend multiple shows in succession or something, much of what's going on between the band is, unless you're a musician, may just go over your head. And I include myself, as not being musically literate enough maybe to pick up on this, and it probably does speak for a lot of the audience. Because they keep talking about it, what they're doing on stage. This, he plays this, does something different, they react. Do you necessarily get it? Well, based on my understanding of the, of recent performances and stuff like that, I don't necessarily get it. And I'm not saying it doesn't happen. I'm just saying it may be that these days, because you don't have those 20 minutes and it's not obvious what's happening now, that this is no longer, the bridge of the song. We're just waiting for the next verse. Oh no, they're jamming now. They don't have the time to devote to it, and it's perhaps not as obvious to the audience if these things are going on. I'm just putting that out there. Which would, I think, stand in stark contrast to the 1970s, where, Lord and Blackmore were clearly building things in the moment, and it was obvious, as I've said, even to the audience. You notice when the singer buggers off and leaves the stage, all right, that's a cue, isn't it? I think I know what's going to happen now. But, I think, again, it's obvious even to the audience then that, that the music was alive and evolving, in almost incandescent performance, unfolding before your eyes. And that's not to denigrate the modern band or Airey in particular. Times change, and I say they may well be, still doing these things. It's just maybe I'm not picking up on it, and maybe other people aren't either. I don't know. Now, I mean, technically, as we know, Airey is flawless. However, having said all that, I still personally do not get the sense that the same level of overt musical risk-taking is present as it was with Lord, and I'm talking about even towards the end of his career with the band. I've said I'm not a musician, and I may well be mistaken, and others may well hear things differently. I mean, the other thing that's obviously, I think, different in a live set, well, also on the records, is Airey is much more inclined to use synthesizers for textures and things like that, as to opposed to Lord, who was very much a Hammond purist most of the time. I have to say, it does not particularly bother me. I mean, if I'm going to be critical of him, I would say that certainly in his early days with the band, his solo spot could be a little bit contrived, predictable, and repetitive. I'm sure we all remember that, ubiquitous Star Wars refrain, which did wear thin rather quickly. And in general terms, even perhaps up until now, I do find his solo spot kind of lacks the fire and bombast which Lord brought to the stage. He has improved, though, and he's I think he's quite good at incorporating some little touches of humor and audience engagement into his performance. And if you think having a glass of wine delivered mid solo or something like that, it's a nice little touch, but I still overall I think live he's playing is more restrained. It's more controlled, less overtly explosive, and yet it's still powerful. And, I think one has to say, though, and it would be remiss of me not, when he is required to, he delivers Lord's lines and notes and performances with complete authority and conviction, the way they should be played. Again, when it comes to being on stage, Airey simply does not have that stage presence that Lord had, and as I've said, it's either something you have or you do not. I once, many years ago, met the legendary actor Sir Christopher Lee. It must have been his late 60s, perhaps 70s at the time. But my God, that man had presence. I've met other tall people. They never had that sort of presence. It is either something you've got or something you don't. But Lord had the ability to hold or captivate your attention simply by being on stage. And if you combine that, with the occasional dramatic flourish he used to introduce, in his younger days, he used to rock the Hammond and those, dramatic poses he used to give, pushing his spectacles back, his nose, and okay, there was a little bit of theatrics going on in that, but my God, it was impressive. And to his credit, Airey does not try to replicate that, because you have to be yourself, and an audience will see through you very quickly, if you're not being genuine. And he has a different approach. He's more relaxed, more easygoing. He's less flamboyant. But it's just a simple fact. Like, he does not have Lord's stage presence. And live, yes, the band did lose a little something because of that. If I can boil this down to a few bullet points, what I would say is that what they lost fundamentally when Lord left was, very much an organ-driven identity as a, central musical force, identifying force, and a very different harmonic tension, and certainly that classical edge is no longer there, and very much a sense of unpredictability. What they gained, however, was, very much stability and consistency, and a much enhanced contribution, I think, to the songwriting process. And I think because of that, there's perhaps a greater balance, or a better balance within the band now. I hate to put it this way, but perhaps that Airey pulling more his weight when it comes to the songwriting. I mean, I have heard it said that Lord is irreplaceable, and yes, it was said at the time. And I mean, it's certainly true in one sense. He most certainly is an Olympian figure. And, historically, Deep Purple would not have become the band they did without him. He defined even their identity. He dominated their early compositions, and his contribution to the band's, live reputation does not require further reiteration. But Airey is not merely a replacement. He has carved his own path, both with and for the band, and full credit to him for doing that. Given his reputation and career, as I initially perhaps feared, Airey could easily have, joined the band, settled into a secure, well-paying gig, and chosen not to rock the boat. But, to his credit, I don't think that's what he did, Instead, he assumed a role that, arguably, Lord himself had long since begun to vacate, even prior to his departure. And in terms of performing, Lord's work, which still, I have to say, and I've discussed this also in other videos, still, informs the majority of their, the live material. But when performing Lord's work, he has shown the taste to know when to play in a manner that honors Lord's legacy, while also possessing the confidence to express his own musical personality. Now, this requires a delicate balance, but it's one that Airey navigates, in my opinion, with commendable assurance, effectiveness, and success. I think more importantly, as I have hopefully made clear, he has made a significant impact in the song, in and to and on the songwriting process, arguably much more so than Lord did for much of his, post-reunion period in the band. And for me at least, the results have been hugely rewarding. Indeed, since Bananas, one could reasonably argue that what we often refer to as the Morse era might equally be described as the Airey era. The only thing is, that's not easy to say. Though it remains quite an achievement, and perhaps one for which he does not receive the level of recognition he deserves. Hopefully, I've made my point. This is not so much about a comparison, although invidious as they may be, they are inevitable. But it's been an observation and perhaps an appreciation of how Airey has and continues to enhance the band's work. He may well be standing on the shoulders of a giant, but he has, for my money, built effectively on his predecessors' efforts, and he has made his own voice heard. And I think the band's music is the better for it. Well, that be my view, or those be my views. Please feel free to like, to share, to subscribe, and all those good things, and obviously to comment. Probably not that contentious, this one. Or maybe it is. Who knows? Anyway, feel free to drop your thoughts. And, as usual, I thank you very much for your indulgence. I wish you well. And until next time, ma chonquière.